thank you for bearing with us. Really appreciate it. Thank you very much. It's a great honor to be here at MAC. This is my first time at MAC. I have to confess, I'm not a professional historian. I'm not a professional, I'm not a museum professional, but I have done some, okay, thank you. I have done some work in oral history, which is what I'm here to talk about today. I want to thank all of you for your presence, for your attendance, for your interest. Thank you very much for being here. So now I'm going to be talking about oral history in museums in relation to the power of listening to history with the experience of an Afro-Caribbean in the Nazi era as an example. The Afro-Caribbean is the gentleman in this picture. His name was Lionel Romney, and he was my father. So now, because it was oral history that provided me access to my father's story, I'd like to spend a bit of time discussing it, starting with the definition of oral history as the intersection of a person's lived experience with historical events and recorded interviews of the person talking about that intersection. So as such, oral history really creates a bridge between individual human experience and historical events. It personalizes and humanizes history by describing it from the perspective of an eyewitness and putting a human face on it. Oral history democratizes history because it provides opportunities for untold perspectives and experiences to be shared. It gives us access to undertold episodes in history. So it helps achieve diversity, equity, and inclusion in the study of history and in education in general. And it helps us see that history is shared by everyone, not only famous people, and that everyone's story is valuable and interesting. Oral history has an importance for African diaspora peoples and all oppressed peoples because Black history has largely been omitted, neglected, remained untold, excluded, misrepresented, and the exclusion of Black history from the mainstream, especially from history books, is a significant element of systemic racism because it makes Black people invisible. It makes Black people invisible to others and, more importantly, to ourselves. And it creates the impression that we did not have a role in certain episodes in history. I'm reminded of this proverb which says that until the lions have their own historians, the history of the hunt will always glorify the hunter. And I think that museums can help us to be the historians of the lions, and one way to do this is through oral history. In oral history, witnesses can now also be called from the underclasses, the unprivileged, and the defeated. It provides a more realistic and fair reconstruction of the past, a challenge to the established account, So oral history is counter-hegemonic because it provides an alternative to and an expansion of the established account, or what I'm referring to as traditional history. In Eurocentric societies, we have endowed the written word with power, I would say undue power, so orality has been devalued and disempowered. Orality has been undervalued relative to literacy, where historical record is concerned. I feel that the written word has been privileged over the spoken word by the same hegemony that has excluded certain people's stories. The story of the past is usually told through education and educational materials, through public iconography and institutions such as museums, among many others. I believe that through their exhibits, museums make powerful and influential statements about which history and whose history is worth preserving, sharing, and learning. Oral history provides opportunities for traditionally excluded histories to be included in the established account. Such is the case of the history of Black victims of the Nazis. this is an area of history that has remained obscured. The experience of an Afro-Caribbean civilian whose capture and imprisonment in the Nazi concentration camp system is an example of a story that only came to light through oral history. So again, the Afro-Caribbean was Lionel Romney, my father, and this is when he lived and his life in geographical terms. But rather than explain it all, I'll just say that number 1 is meant to represent the Dutch side of St. Martin, and number 2 is meant to represent Aruba, Curacao, and Venezuela, which are 3 more places where my father lived in his pre-war life. So now I'm going to outline my father's World War II experience as he told it to me in his oral history. So now, as a civilian, he was a sailor on cargo ships sailing between the Caribbean, North America, and Europe from the mid-1930s until 1940. And in June 1940, he was aboard the SS Makis, which was a Greek merchant ship sailing through the Mediterranean from Cardiff in Wales on its way to Greece. And when the ship reached the area between Tunisia and Sicily, it struck a floating mine. As you know, a mine is an explosive device. And when it struck the mine, it sank. But the crew was rescued by a ship from the Italian Navy. So I can't see the cursor on this screen, so I have to kind of look over here and see. So when the ship reached the area between Tunisia and Sicily, somewhere in these waters, somewhere around here it must have struck the mine. And when it did, and the Italian Navy ship rescued the crew, that was how my father became a political prisoner in Italy. So for the next 4 years, he was transferred through a series of internment camps in Italy until 1944, when he was deported from this area of Italy to the Mauthausen concentration camp in Austria, which is right about there. And he remained a prisoner there until the camp was liberated by the US Army at the end of the war. Now, being taken to Mauthausen put him squarely in the hands of the Nazis. So I want to say a word about Mauthausen within the context of the concentration camp system. Now, as you know, there were different kinds of concentration camps. There were death camps, also known as extermination camps. There were labor camps. There were prison camps. There were women's camps. There were transit camps. But Mauthausen was unique. It was the only camp in the entire concentration camp system that was specifically intended to work the prisoners to death. It was the only death through work camp in the entire system. About 200,000 people were imprisoned there over the life of the camp, about 90,000 of whom were worked to death, tortured to death, starved to death, and died in other ways. The concentration camp at Mauthausen was constructed in 1938 because of a quarry. It sat on top of the largest granite quarry in Austria. And the Nazis built a concentration camp there because they needed a captive labor force to quarry the granite and extract the stones. My father witnessed the destruction of human life every day that he was at Mauthausen, which was almost a year. And he was always wondering if he would be next. The result was that he was deeply traumatized by his experience, so much so that he was virtually silent about it for over 40 years. But finally, at the end of 1989, he opened up and began to talk about it. I never thought he would because it had taken me over 20 years to get him to talk about it. So I want to play a few minutes of his very first conversation about his imprisonment at Mauthausen. And this is from our first oral history interview that we ever had together. And of course, this is a picture of my father and me in our first interview on this date. Sorry, I can't keep this thing on this date. Okay, so. Trying to find it, sorry.
There you go.
And so then, after the war,
Where were you when the war ended?
I was in the camp in Austria.
In Austria, not in Germany.
No, in Germany, in Austria.
In
we
Austria.
came in from Italy. They took us to Austria.
By train.
Yeah, cattle, what the hell you call it?
A cattle car.
Yeah, cattle car. Everybody, what a bundle in there.
And where in Austria?
It was up in the place, it's near to Graz. That's a concentration camp, one of those notorious concentration camps. Maartener. It's up on the hill. They had the crematoriums and the camps, you know. The barracks like thing, you know, I had so many people in the barracks. So we were liberated in 1945, the 10th of May.
10th of May.
1945. About a couple of days before Hitler died.
Oh, really? That's interesting.
We were liberated by the Fifth Army, the American Fifth Army.
A couple of days afterwards?
A couple of days before Hitler died.
Did you ever have any close calls?
Were you ever in, what kind of danger would you say you were in during that time?
Oh, every day was dangerous. There wasn't a day that wasn't, you know, considered. Sometimes you said, so how the hell they gonna get out of here? And then we heard some of the, you know, different things from the atrocities of the Germans was committing in the camps. Like before they leave, they kill everybody.
Right.
See if they have to run away. But we were up close to the place in Austria where we were. It was close to the Czechoslovakian border. You can hear the Russian cannonading, and you can hear the concussion from the artillery, you know.
Oh, yeah.
Now, in the next excerpt, you will hear him talking about his constant fears and always wondering if he would be the next one to die and what it was like to be a captive. He also imitates the SS guards speaking in German. As you know, the SS was an elite military corps that guarded the camps, and the SS was responsible for many or most of the atrocities committed in the concentration camp system. Let's try this.
The most fearful part was in the night when I came, the SS man would come in the night call up a number. 7,700 upstate. Get up. You fight like hell because you don't know when you're going to call your number. But you take the kid out, you don't see him anymore.
Right.
At that time, the night, the lights is off.
Right.
Big roast. Upstate. Antreten. Come on. Then I used to come in every day, twice a day, in the morning and the afternoon, to check to see if anybody got away.
Right. Did a lot of people escape?
No, you couldn't escape. I mean, maybe some people did escape, but they tracked them down. But I mean, the people in the lager, you couldn't escape. Once you got in there, they had the guards in the big, they have electric wire all around the ward, a guardhouse there, and they have some of the prisoners in the camp, so they come and check to see if everybody was in there. Then you had to line up, and you had to put off, you have to get such man come in, take off, Smithson up, sitting up.
So now I want to play another excerpt, but before I do, I need to contextualize it with these images. Now, I mentioned the quarry. And this is the stairway leading down to the floor of the quarry. And this is what it looks like when you're down at the bottom of that stairway looking up. And of course, you know, it's full of vegetation because the quarry has not been used in over 7 decades. But you kind of have to imagine that without all that vegetation. And this stairway is called the Stairway of Death. Now, this is what it looked like when it was in use. This is what it looked like when it was in use. What you have to remember is that the prisoners were starving. And it's also important to remember that it was the Nazis' intention to work the prisoners to death in this camp. And this is one of the ways, this is the main way in which they did it. So what you see here are prisoners marching in formation up the stairway of death. So they're marching up this stairway here. They're marching up the stairway of death, and each one is carrying a box on his back. And in the box is a 50-kilo block of granite. That's 110 pounds. So again, remember, these people were starving. So a lot of prisoners died on this stairway, carrying these blocks of granite up the stairs multiple times a day because their bodies could not take the stress of this kind of weight multiple times a day in the condition, in the physical, in the deteriorated and weakened physical condition that they were in. So a lot of prisoners died on this stairway. Now, even when they didn't die, a lot of them just collapsed from exhaustion. And when they did, they would fall backwards. And this would cause a whole cascade of prisoners and blocks of granite falling onto each other. And a lot of them died in that way as well. So these are 2 reasons why this is referred to as the Stairway of Death. And this is how my father remembers it. Let's try. No. Trying to use it without the mouse. Let me see. Let me try it.
They had a big gully. They had a big box on the shoulder. And the guys down there opened the strap them on. They put a big piece of stone and made them walk up from the gully up to the top. Sometimes the SS men is gone. And you couldn't walk too close to the SS men. Because once a guy jumped for himself in the SS man. Because he couldn't, you know, some people were, you know, very young. I'll tell you something, the young Russian guys was fearless. I want to sometimes you say, so where the hell a kid like this is doing in a camp? I mean, what crime can he have committed? And they didn't care. In the end of when the train was falling, you know, the Germans knew they was going to lose the war, even more vicious.
I saw the Stairway of Death and many other parts of the camp when I visited Mauthausen. And this is something else I saw at Mauthausen. And it's how I became aware of the role and power of oral history in museums. And I've never forgotten the experience. Mauthausen had a lot of survivors all over Europe in the few decades after the war. And some of their stories were collected for the museum at Mauthausen in the form of oral histories on video. You can watch and listen to a video of an individual survivor's testimony in the original language and subtitled in English or German. And these survivors were from practically every country in Europe. And these are what a few of the video stations look like now. As you can see, the videos are displayed along with relevant artifacts that in some way complement the survivor's testimony. And of course, my father's testimony could have been one of these. I realize that there are many ways of incorporating oral history in museums, but I just wanted to show you this one because I've seen it. I believe that much of the power of museums resides in the ability to make history tangible. And oral history also does this by making it possible to listen to history. I also believe that oral history in African diaspora museums honors the oral tradition of African diaspora peoples. When I think about history, I'm often reminded of this excerpt from a poem by Maya Angelou, who says that history, despite its wrenching pain, cannot be unlived, but if faced with courage, need not be lived again. And oral history helps us face it with courage. Of course, one of the main reasons to study history in the first place is exactly what Maya Angelou says about not repeating it. Oral history in Caribbean museums can have a role in decolonization by creating visibility for marginalized communities whose experiences have been excluded from the established account, by increasing inclusivity of those whose role in history is usually disregarded or unknown. Oral history broadens the focus and extends it to eyewitnesses who can provide alternative perspectives on history. And I think that it can have a decolonizing effect on museums by championing empathy, because oral history dignifies the voice of everyday people by giving it an audience. And of course, these categories are from the book Practicing Decoloniality in Museums. And this is my father immediately after the end of World War II, somewhere in the United Kingdom. His experience was an example of an untold story that only came to light because of oral history. So it was through oral history that I was able to reframe my own perceptions of the Nazi era to a broader, more diverse, and more inclusive understanding of that period in history. So in closing, I would just like to say that I hope that I've provided an example of why and how to include oral history in Caribbean museums. And I hope that my experience with oral history will encourage you and others to embark on oral history projects with your families and members of your communities. So thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mary, for sharing your
Thank
family
you.
history with us.
Thank you.
We have 5 minutes for questions if anyone has any.
Nobody's in here next, so maybe we can go a little bit longer. Oh, okay. I guess not.
Thank you so much. This is fascinating. This is
Thank
just
you.
mind-blowing. And is your book for sale somewhere?
Only on Amazon. Yeah. Oh, the question was if my book is for sale somewhere, and the answer is only on Amazon.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
No,
Mhm. Yeah.
Thank you again for sharing this. I was wondering what kind of like methods and techniques you would be open to sharing for approaching family members to talk about trauma, or anything to do for life. But I know that trauma is something that everyone would want to talk about.
Yeah. Did you hear the question? The question was what methods and techniques would I recommend for people who would like to get their elders to provide oral histories. And I'm working on that. When I did this with my father, I knew nothing about oral history. I mean, absolutely nothing. I just had conversations with him. I really didn't know how to interview or anything like that, but I've been thinking about it because I encourage every family, especially African diaspora families, but I encourage every family to do oral history with their elders because, again, our history is not in the books. So a lot of it is only available in the memories of the old people. So I've been thinking a lot about how to encourage elderly people to open up because, as you say, there's a lot of trauma involved. And they often don't want to. So I've been trying to develop some strategies, and I think that one way is to start with something that they want to remember, their own parents, their own grandparents, whatever, and things that those people taught them. I think you need to start as far back as you can possibly go, and that will lead them automatically to their own lives. So by the time they get comfortable talking about someone else's life, then maybe it'll open them up a little bit more to talking about their own lives. But I mean, I have other ideas that I don't really have time to go into right now, but I can be contacted, and I'm very happy to share more of them. And then when I get my workshop worked out, I can put that information on the website as well. But yes. Oh, sorry. You handled the question.
No, it's
sorry.
okay. Valerie and then Veronica.
Thank you for sharing your story. When you started preserving your father's history, did you know you wanted to share it to others, and did you know?
Yeah, the question was whether, when I started doing the oral history, whether or not I had intended to share it with others, and whether or not my father knew that I was going to share it. The answer is no and no. I only wanted to do it for the family. I just wanted to keep it in the family so that they would know something about their ancestors. And I never intended to do a book until I visited Mauthausen, until I came home from Mauthausen the first time I visited. And I started writing, I don't know why, but I started writing my memories about it. And because there were things that I didn't want to forget, so I started writing them down. And then people were asking me to do presentations, and so I started having to organize the information. And I think through that, and I don't know, maybe my husband said, well, you should write a book. I don't really know, but I somehow came to the idea of writing the book, but it was not during the time when I was recording the oral history with my father. Oh. He was not. He passed away in 2004, and we visited Mauthausen for the first time in 2006. Yeah.
Congratulations for the great job.
Thank you.
I just wanted to know how much time did you pass with your father in order to collect all this information? Because I know it's not easy, but you said that 20 years you were trying for him to talk, and then it was 20 years past when you started really collecting the information. So how much time after he started opening up you took with him?
Yeah, that's yeah. The question is, how much time did I spend doing the oral history with my father?
Yeah.
And the answer is, well, we really started doing it very consistently in 1994. And we did it until the end of his life, which was 2004. So I didn't do it every week, didn't do it every month. I did it maybe like 5 times a year, 4 times a year, something like that. But, not that often. But I did it over a period of 10 years. Yeah. Yeah.
And last question. Sorry.
I'm curious to know, sort of emotionally speaking, from his perspective, throughout those 4 or 5 times a year for 10 years, do you see a difference in him in terms of maybe feeling as he let out things that he had held up and he was on the
Yeah, the question is whether or not I saw a difference in my father as a result of him releasing all of that, all of what had been inside of him for so long. And the answer is, I didn't see that much difference, but I know that there was a difference because, part of post-traumatic stress disorder is the silence. People in post-traumatic stress are almost always silent. And a lot of that is conscious. They try to remain silent so that they can distance themselves from the memory. But just the opposite is true. The longer you keep it inside, the worse. It's much worse for you mentally and in other ways. And it just intensifies the post-traumatic stress. The only way to relieve that stress is by externalizing it. And the only way to do that is by talking or writing, but usually talking. So I know that he underwent a transformation, but I didn't see it externally that much.
your empathy, the word empathy comes up again.
Mm-hmm.
I think you make, my father passed a year ago. I was like, man, she was really recording so much history that he had the big bonus. He was the president of the cultural center in Puerto Rico as a volunteer for 15 years. They named after his last, he wasn't alive to have seen the new cultural center. They used an old public school in Rincon on the west coast of Puerto Rico. And in the funeral, the city, came and they said, we had a surprise for him. But he knew, I mean, that he at least shared, you know, he kind of expected that at least maybe they would name it. And so, wow, you make me have some great ideas too. You know, I was able to document people as I was in town. Because everywhere I go in Lincoln, someone goes, "You got beautiful work at Jesus Boy," and they go up and I go, "Can I just film you?" So I have, can I please document what you tell me so that I can share with my colleagues?
Yeah.
Thank you, because it helps many of us, I think,
Yeah.
make sure that we try to do something.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for sharing that. But I guess the last thing I'll have an opportunity to say to you is don't let that happen. You know, I mean, get your stories from your old people now while you have your old people, you know. It's very, very important. You know, I had the same experience with my mother. I only got 1 or 2 sessions of oral history with her. And then she passed away. And I said, oh no, why didn't I make more of an effort? Why didn't I get more oral history with her? Why didn't I spend more time doing that? You know, and I was just full of torment. And I said, I'm not going to let that happen with my father. And that was why she passed away in 94. And at that point, I very intensively, 95, I very intensively started with my father. And yeah. So a lot of people say exactly what you said. My family member just passed away, and now I'm sorry that I didn't get more. So please, everybody, do oral histories with your family. It's very, very important. Start as far back as you can with the oldest family members. And, and it should be, don't think of it as something that you do once. It should be something ongoing, because you'll never get the full story anyway. But get as much as you can, and keep it moving, keep it going. Do it a few times a year or whenever you see them. It's very important. So good luck with that, and thank you very, very much.
Thank you so much.